The following video contains adult content that some may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Where to begin? Probably at the beginning, or at least what I consider to be my beginning. The day that set the course for the rest of my life. Fuck the party! Fuck Zivashi! The chanting had become an ear-splitting rumble, fueled by hundreds of frenzied voices. A bloodthirsty mob of Wardonians spilled out across the grimy streets, waving placards and pumping their fists in the air. The rage was infectious. Even as a child, tightly clutching Dad's hand and clinging to his leg, I could feel the flames of righteous anger roaring inside of me. A woman in a frilly dress who stood next to us was holding a sign with "The voice of the people is louder than the voice of tyrants" scrawled across it in bright red letters. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know why we hated Zivashi or even what the Kefuru party was. All I knew is that we were angry, and that made me angry. Fuck off home, leave us alone. I didn't think it was possible for the screaming of the mob to get any louder, but as the swell of virtuous fury blossomed, the chants rose into the thundering roar of a rabid animal. The Zivashi soldiers stood in a line opposite us, rich caramel skin under inky black armor. They clutched their automatic weapons as if they were knights of old, wielding halberds, and their faces were obscured by visored helmets. In the eyes of a 7-year-old, they looked like killer robots out of a science fiction movie. I remember thinking that the soldiers reminded me of the evil Nachsterin from Professor Falconpont. This was back in the days when Gultiska was allowed its own TV channels, before all of our programs were replaced by slop that had been carefully approved by Kefuru. I watched the Zivashi remake of Professor Falconpont a few years ago. I think that it was the party's attempt at cashing in on Gultiskan nostalgia. The remake was a complete shit show and it got cancelled after 2 seasons. You ain't so fucking tough. Have a go if you think you're hard enough. Dad gave my sweaty hand a reassuring squeeze. Don't worry, darling, he whispered in his routinely chipper, working-class Wardonian cadence. Your papa's got ya. The wave of cruel anticipation that was thrumming through the soldiers was so palpable that it felt like a physical force, even as an airheaded 7-year-old. I couldn't see their faces, but the tenseness in their body language and the way they gripped their assault rifles told me that they were salivating at the prospect of opening fire. Back then, I had no idea that 10 Zivashi soldiers had been blown up by the Gultiska Liberation Army the week before the protest march. Kefuru had responded by rounding up known dissenters and throwing them into Fegwa internment camp. One of the nefarious troublemakers was 14 and had been beaten to death by the camp's guards for spitting at them. The cry of "fuck the party, fuck Zivashi" came round again, and this time I screamed my little lungs out joining in. A boisterous fart of laughter came booming out of Dad. "You're a chip off the old block, my girl," Dad chuckled. "We'll make a rebel of you yet." Suddenly, my whole body filled with a warm, wonderful feeling of belonging. Happiness fizzled in every cell of my being. I was a little girl whose daddy was proud of her. It didn't get much better than that. That was when the brick went soaring over my head. I never saw who threw it. I just looked up to see a block of ugly red stone hurtling through the air. The brick impacted with a dry crunch, smashing into one of the soldiers and sending a jagged crack splintering through his visor. We all cheered, spurred on by the daring and defiance of our mysterious brick-throwing hero. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realised it was almost certainly a Zivashi plant who had thrown the brick. The soldiers were itching for an excuse to open fire, and now they had one. The armour-clad, faceless figures raised their rifles. can just about remember the rattling of gunfire, the stench of blood, and the sudden eruption of terrified shrieking. I don't think I've ever heard such raw fear in a scream as I did on that day. I remember bodies slamming into the ground, shoving and pushing, and defiant revolutionaries trampling over each other as they scrabbled to get away from a hailstorm of bullets. I remember the woman in the frilly dress shrieking like a bird as she was knocked to the ground, her sign slipping from her fingers and clattering against hard stone. I remember her petrified shrieking becoming a wet gurgle as a man in chunky black boots stomped on her head whilst he scuttled away like a beetle. A burst of gunfire sliced into Dad's chest, and his grip became loose as he crumpled and crashed to the ground. I was weeping and howling for my daddy when a bullet burrowed through my skull, embedding itself into the gooey matter of my brain. That was when darkness swallowed me, and I died. I'm just fucking with you. My login got awfully fucking scrambled though, which takes us to now. The day that everything went to shit started somewhat predictably shit. I was in an absolutely rancid mood by the time I reached work. Griff and I had one of our screaming matches the night before, and doesn't matter. Out of context, it'll make me sound like a bitch. I told him I was sorry, but he wouldn't talk to me. I spent the tram ride to work just sort of staring listlessly out of the window. Had a quick bit of no strings attached fun with my old co-dealer. Spiraled into the most bland, flavourless long-term relationship in the history of creation. I didn't have the energy for a breakup, and I certainly didn't have the energy for an affair. My reflection stared back at me with tired eyes. In my head, I was still a cool, sexy, punk rock teenager. The way I felt inside didn't correlate with the pudgy woman in her mid-20s, dressed in bland, office-appropriate clothes, who I saw in the window. I'd been putting honey in my coffee instead of sugar in a dismal attempt to lose weight, but Reese the postman asked me if I was pregnant, which absolutely flooded me with a wonderful sense of accomplishment and happiness. Prick. Big Boss Pranav told me I smelled like cigarette smoke whilst he was doing his usual routine of strutting about the office like a peacock with a metal rod jammed up its arse. I have a very love-hate relationship with Pranav. He is an insufferable nepo baby bellend, but he also happens to be disgustingly fit. He's like some kind of mythical creature, chiseled out of stone and wreathed in gold. Pranav has long, effeminate hair that cascades down his shoulders, which I fantasize about pulling on when I am A, thinking about shagging him, and B, thinking about killing him. What can I say? I'm a sucker for pretty men. As if being called a smelly fatty wasn't already the ideal way to start the working day. The story on everybody's lips that morning was Kefaru's announcement that the promise to return democratic elections to Gultiska had been postponed by another year. High Chancellor Eladasab released a statement that Kefaru was tremendously pleased with the bridges that had been formed between Gultiska and Zivashi, but that the party does not feel that the tumultuous situation in Gultiska is sufficiently settled enough for a peaceful transfer of sovereignty to be achieved. I'm sure Kefaru's decision to keep on hanging around Gultiska like vultures picking at a rotten carcass had everything to do with concerns for our safety and nothing to do with the fact that they could pay us a measly fraction of what Zivashi workers were entitled to. It's a fucking disgrace, old man Morris grumbled to me, leaning out from behind the screen of his computer. This never would have happened back when we was a monarchy. The revolution was the worst thing that ever happened to Gultiska. Now we're gonna get buggered by the fucking Zarvis until the sun explodes. Even as he moaned and groaned, Morris was sure to keep his voice at an angry whisper. Big boss Pranav wasn't just Sivashi. His dad was Kefiru's finance chancellor. Slagging off Sivashi was a surefire way to get fired. The mood in the office was already deeply depressing, but I was sat next to man-child Matthew, who insisted on droning in my ear about the latest Cosmosar movie, despite the fact I was doing everything in my power to articulate how not interested I was in his suicide-inducing prattle. Mr. Manchild was gushing about the shocking revelation that Princess What's-Her-Name was the secret daughter of evil Emperor. I don't give a shit. I told him that all 50,000 Cosmosar movies didn't hold a candle to the original Professor Falconpond. Matthew called me a normie. I called him a cunt. Matthew reported me for workplace bullying. I was a claims processor for the Gortiscan branch of Ramakadosh, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I spent most of my days staring blankly at working class families whilst they bawled their eyes out because I told them their request for a tuberculosis medication had been rejected. Judge me all you want. A job is a job. I'm not going to feel bad about the deaths of people who mean nothing to me. Death is a constant. I'll die one day, and I don't expect random strangers to give a shit about me. Empathy and compassion were useful survival mechanisms once upon a time, but now they're just really fucking annoying baggage. I don't know if it's because I got shot in the head, because of my shitty childhood, because of my 3 years as one of Sith Rafe's hired guns, or a delicious combination of all of the above, but I am constantly reminded of how lucky I am that I genuinely do not give a fuck about the rest of my species. Pranav called me into his office 20 minutes before I was due to go home. Internally, I was rumbling with irritation, but I was sure to keep a sweet, obedient smile plastered across my face. The best way to move through life without obstructions is to maintain the masquerade of doughy-eyed compliance. If everyone thinks you're a meek little sheep, then they'll let a wolf go sauntering right past them. Did you see the new Cosmosar movie? Pranav asked me as I sat down, making a pitiable stab at small talk. Small talk was never a good sign. If Big Boss Pranav was trying to butt me out with idle chatter, it's because he was trying to soften the iron fist he was about to slam straight into my face. Yeah, I lied, desperately trying to recall some of the plot details man-child Matthew had been vomiting all over me. I liked the bit with the spaceship. Curse you, brain. You abandoned me in my hour of need. I will not forget this treachery. Thankfully, Pranav didn't seem the slightest bit interested in my response. I think the quickest way to articulate the sort of man Pranav is by telling you about the massive painting that was spread across the back wall of his office. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a big red and orange flower, but when I looked closer, I realised it was a mushroom cloud. The painting depicted the day that Kefiru dropped a nuclear bomb on Holgrad, the short-lived capital, during the Commodore's ludicrously brief stint as Gultiska's government. Sivashi had dropped a nuclear bomb on us and then snatched up control of our country. My boss thought that was an appropriate thing to proudly commemorate in an office manned by the very people his nation had fucked until we bled from our assholes. I need to talk to you about the Howl case, Bethan, Pranav explained, pressing both hands flat on his enormous blackwood desk. I know you've got quite an attachment to that one. That made me bolt upright in my chair. Nia Howell was one of the last links to the life I'd had before I lost Dad. She was kind to an absolutely ridiculous degree, and had basically been a second mum to all the kids on the street I'd grown up on. I know, I said I hate all humans, but Nia wasn't human. She was like some kind of ludicrously sweet angel person. I told Pranav, trying to keep the anxiety that was creeping through me from bleeding into my voice. Nia did a hell of a lot to take care of me when I was growing up. She's a pillar of the community. Beyond that, she's never done anything to mess me around or cause the company any grief. A few weeks after I started at Ramakadash, Nia had a heart attack. She pulled through by the absolute skin of her teeth, but was told in no uncertain terms that she would need to be on medication to regulate her blood pressure for the rest of her life. There wasn't a hope in hell she could afford the cost of her new meds, and health insurance was equally out of the question. In a pretty pathetic attempt at improving their public image in Gortiska, Ramakadash ran a program where employees could nominate especially deserving individuals to receive massively discounted medication. Nia had been my nomination, and her status as a local hero had meant that my nomination had been approved. "I'm aware," Pranav said curtly, "Miss Howell's position as a pillar of the community is exactly what encouraged me to accept your nomination. That won us a lot of good press with the locals." "Why do I get the feeling you're about to say something I don't want to hear?" I asked Big Boss Pranav, a slight spell of dizziness thrumming behind my eyes due to the nerves I was feeling. I don't usually get nervous, especially on behalf of others, and the gnawing anxiety was a really unfucking welcome sensation. "One of the big takeaways from the annual review was that we're making a decent profit, but we could be making more," Pranav told me, giving his knuckles a dull crack. "Good press is nice, but it doesn't outweigh increased capital." Gnawing anxiety turned into a gut-wrenching stab of terror. "Are you scrapping the underprivileged program?" I asked, any facade of composure melting away. "Not entirely," Big Boss Pranav explained, "but I am reducing the number of clients we'll be offering the underprivileged exemption to. I'm sorry to say that Mrs. Howell will no longer qualify." He wasn't sorry at all. Years spent as an outsider had made me very good at studying the nuances of human behavior. I'd become an expert at the little indicators which differentiate authenticity and bullshit. There wasn't so much as a drop of regret in his phony apology. For my 7th birthday, that got me an action figure of Drania, the Amethyst Witch, from Professor Falconpon. I took her everywhere with me. I ran around the neighborhood imagining I was Drania, doing her stupid evil cackle and pretending to cast spells on the other kids. 3 older girls beat the shit out of me, hitting me so hard that they cracked my eye socket and threw my action figure in the canal. To say I was inconsolable doesn't even begin to describe how utterly dismayed I was. Nia Howell's hobby was whittling dolls out of wood, then crocheting new clothes for them. When Nia found out what the other girls had done to me, she used my Professor Falconpon annual to get a reference picture of Drania and hand-made me a new toy, painting on her facial features with graceful swirls of her brush. I still keep Nia's Amethyst Witch doll in my room. That kind, selfless saint of a woman was who my boss was condemning to death, without a second thought. "She'll die, you know she will," I roared, the bubbling of volcanic rage utterly overwhelming rational thought. "If you take away her meds, you're killing her." In the fringes of my vision, I could see my astonished co-workers gawking at us through Pranav's massive windows. There was the rare occasion when I let the odd sharp retort or dark joke wriggle through my mask of humanity, but for the most part, I was a compliant little slave whilst I was at work. My colleagues had never seen me legitimately angry before. They'd never been this close to the flames of hate that burned and blazed inside my black little heart. "You're way out of line," Pranav barked back at me. You need to call it now. I knew that the smart thing to do was keep my head down and veer out of harm's way, but the fury inside of me was a smouldering inferno that eclipsed the dim flickering of rational thought. Morris's underprivileged case is some tart with 9 children, I snapped back. She could afford her meds if she could keep her legs shut for 5 fucking minutes. Take her exemption away. Morris's underprivileged case covers children's vitamins, Bethan, Pranav replied. They cost us a fraction of what blood pressure medication does. I've made my decision. You need to pack it in and do as you're told. I may not have been in as good shape as I had been when I served with Sithwraith, but I was still a trained killer. I spent 6 months rooting out Hesticilla-backed rebels during the Varinia uprising. I'd soaked myself in blood at the Battle of Solcellum. Hell, I ticked off war crimes like they were a checklist. At the Trangau massacre, above all else, I was a warrior, and the warrior inside of me was begging me to stab Big Boss Pranav in the fucking throat. I wanted to hear him choke on his own blood, whilst I smeared it across my face like war paint. Fortunately, the methodical part of my brain just about managed to overpower the stabby part. I'll call Nia first thing in the morning, and let her know. I hissed through gritted teeth. Was there anything else you wanted to talk to me about? I was going to be thinking about yanking on Pranav's hair that night, and not in the sexy way. I left work feeling like shit. It was like I'd managed to keep my conscience at bay all these years, but the situation with Nia had finally smashed the floodgates open, and I was drowning in over a decade of repressed guilt. I hated feeling shame. I hated how it knocked the wind out of my sails and made me question everything I knew about myself. I was a monster. That wasn't up for debate. It was as undeniable as gravity. At Trangau, my unit and I had laughed as we'd set civilians alight with our flamethrowers, and I had felt raw, erotic euphoria flooding through every atom of my being as I watched human beings blacken and burn. I'd done far worse than what I was going to do to Nia Morris, and I had delighted in it. Why did it feel different with her? Because she was old? Because she made me a doll when I was a kid? Instead of taking the tram home, I decided to drown my sorrows at the Wailing Banshee. I had nothing to go home to. Griff would still be giving me the silent treatment, and I'd probably end up ordering a takeaway, then getting in a huff when my jeans made me look like a sausage that was spilling out of its skin. My body was screaming at me to fill it with vodka and quiet the jumbled mess of thoughts that was screeching in my skull. I power walked to the Wailing Banshee, appalled at how quickly I got out of breath, and felt my heart banging in my chest like a toddler, clumsily smacking a drum. The streets were coated in grime, and I couldn't make it 2 minutes without passing somebody who was sprawled out across the pavement. I had no idea if they were sleeping rough, passed out from a day of heavy drinking, or even potentially dead and rotting. Had Werden always been such a rancid shithole? This used to be the capital city of a great and powerful empire. Now it was a diarrhea-soaked toilet, clogged with needles and fanny rags. I passed a faded brick wall with a gargantuan dragon, fringed in a circlet of blooming daffodils smeared across it. The symbol was wrought from bright red spray paint, the symbol of the extinct Commodore Party, a memento of the Great Revolution and that blissful period between the collapse of the Empire and the Zavashi occupation. They called it the Great Revolution, but our dream of a better life had been smothered by atomic flames when Kefaru nuked Hallrod into oblivion. There was no brighter future. Some people just couldn't let go of the past. I got to the Wailing Banshee about 10 to 6, and the bar was already depressingly full. A woman who looked like a beached walrus having a stroke, snorting lines of white powder off of a table, apparently as allergic to discretion as she was to plucking her top lip. A group of tomato-red geezers were chain-smoking over some unappetizing, piss-coloured pints. The biggest of the group had the skull and tendrils of the marrow mark splattered across one enormous bicep in thick black ink. But if anyone in the bar took umbrage with the towering ogre proudly flaunting the emblem of Gultiska's most infamous white supremacist group, then they were keeping their gripes to themselves. I clambered up onto a bar stool, trying to ignore how my bum drooped over the chair like cellulite-riddled jelly, and ordered the strongest bottle of vodka that I could afford. I was 6 shots down when somebody tapped me softly on the shoulder. "I like your patch," said a young man with skin the colour of dark chocolate. The Night Raven Horde, right? The vodka had dulled my brain, and it took me a hot minute to realise he meant the patch that was sewn onto the shoulder of my jacket. It depicted a purple raven with 6 eyes unfurling its wings. That was the emblem of the Night Raven Horde, the evil army of the sinister amethyst witch from my beloved Professor Falconbond. "Oh, yeah, it is," I replied, offering a faint smile. I was in the sort of mood where I was ready to tell anyone who wanted to start a conversation to go jump off of a balcony. I always had time for people who wanted to yammer about my favourite childhood TV show. "I always liked the bad guys," he laughed, raising his glass of whiskey and a mock toast. I had such a crush on Commandant Gefzan growing up. A man after my own heart. "Me too," I confessed with a grin. Emyr Morgan was so good in that role. I remember when the news broke that he died in that car crash. I was absolutely heartbroken. "The good ones always die too young," my mysterious new friend exclaimed. "My mum met Emyr at a convention once. Apparently he was a total sweetie." "You'd never think that watching him as Gefzan," I replied. "He was such a convincing villain." I was surprised to find some of the tension draining out of my body, and a dim spark of happiness oscillating in my chest. It was nice to feel like a normal person, even if it was just for a fleeting moment. The world seemed that tiny bit brighter than when I had come into the bar. Was this what human connection felt like? I can remember the last time I'd had a conversation I was genuinely invested in, rather than one I was ambling through to maintain my masquerade of normality. Even when I was with my boyfriend, the person I was supposed to love most in the world, I was playing some kind of dull caricature of an ordinary person. "I'm Bethan, by the way," I told my new friend. "Zayden," the dark-skinned young man replied. "Zayden Colt." My full name was Bethan Turner Wickroof. I'd taken Turner from my blood family, and Wickroof from Victoria Wickroof, the dazzling firecracker of a woman that had raised me after Zavashi soldiers killed Dad and shot me in the head. The Wickroof family had been bona fide nobility during the days of the Gultiskan Empire, but by the time Victoria adopted me, Gultiska was completely and utterly Zavashi's bitch, and the decadent grandeur of the old aristocracy had faded into a shiny memory. "What's got you knocking back whiskey in this shithole on a Monday evening, Zayden Cole?" I asked him, shocking myself with the realization that I actually wanted to continue talking to this stranger. "Shit day at work," he told me. "You?" "Shit day at work," I mimicked. We clinked our glasses. "Ain't this cute?" a gravelly voice snarled. "Look at you both, mingling." I cast a glance over my shoulder and realised that the muscle-bound ogre with blistering red skin and a black marrow mark tattoo was standing behind us. "Are you not embarrassed?" I shot him an irritated glare. "Go be a bellend somewhere else." The twat with the racist tattoo had revealed himself to be racist. A truly shocking turn of events, I know. "Leave it, Owen," one of the ogre's mates called over from their booth. "Let's just enjoy our drinks, yeah?" Owen ignored his buddy. "Pure Gultiskan stock dirtying itself with Lagundi filth," the ogre spat at us. "You make me puke." "I'm going to need you to move forward with the understanding that there were a lot of slurs being thrown around that I have redacted from this jolly exchange. My family have been in Gultiska for 4 generations. Zayden snapped back at the tomato-coloured racist. "And before that, we came from Morad, not Lagundi. We fought for Gultiska in the Shadow War. We laid down our lives for this country. What did your family do, other than use their benefits to buy the next round of the pub?" Tension was fizzling in the air like electricity. I watched a vein bulge in Alwyn's forehead. whilst his hands balled into fists. I was grappling with this primal yearning that was crackling inside of me like a frenzied burst of electricity. We all have this kind of deep, primeval code slumbering away inside of us, linking us back to the savage warriors that birthed our species. My code had whirred to life, like it was a computer booting up. And it was salivating at the prospect of shedding blood. Owen was easily a foot taller than me, and every inch of him was caked in rock-solid muscle. There was no way in hell I could take him in a fair fight. Now that he was closer, I also spotted Becca and Ceres inked across his rock-solid neck. Were they his children's names? His girlfriends? The nicknames he gave his testicles? He had one people, one empire, one master scrawled on his right arm in the same shoddy black ink as the rest of his tattoos. This wasn't an amateur bigot who engaged in a little bit of cheeky racism at the weekends to blow off some steam. This was an irrefutable, bona fide fascist. I stealthily slipped one hand into my handbag, my fingers coiling around a canister of pepper spray. "You ain't Galtiscan," Owen, the angry ogre, roared at Zayden, flecks of spittle rocketing out of his mouth. "Fuck off back to Morad. You should worry less about me, and more about your rank fucking breath, mate," Zayden said with a burst of goading laughter. Owen lunged forward, grabbing my drinking buddy by the scruff of his t-shirt. Moving with the martial swiftness that had been imbued in me by my time with Sithwraith, I whipped the canister out of my handbag and unloaded a burst of pepper spray straight into Owen's piggy little eyes. The tomato-coloured ogre let out an agonised squeal, flailing around wildly with his arms. Whilst Owen was thrashing madly about the place, his hand smacked me in the side of the face. I fell off my stool, hot pain exploding in my cheek, and my head slammed into the bar counter. I landed in a heap on the perturbingly sticky floor, white stars dancing and twinkling through my vision. "Out! Now!" I looked up to see the bald bartender standing behind the counter, a stocky shotgun clasped in both hands. He was pointing the sawed-off shotgun straight at Owen, his round belly bulging beneath a much too tight sleeveless vest. "Fuck you!" Owen hissed, rubbing his puffy red eyes as he stomped out of the bar, his two buddies trailing after him. All eyes in the Wailing Banshee gazed anxiously at the bartender. "Sorry about that, folks," the bartender called out. "Everyone gets a shot of tequila. On the house." A thunderous cheer reverberated through the bar. Zayden and I gave up on the Wailing Banshee, moving to a cramped little fast food joint that sold greasy burgers and pizza until the crack of daylight. "That prick really got me," I grumbled, rubbing my sore head as I picked at a portion of oil-soaked chips. The flesh around where I'd been struck had puffed up like a balloon, and it ached with this constant, dull, throbbing kind of pain. "Sorry about that." Zayden offered me an apologetic smile. "I wasn't looking to start anything. It's not your fault I got twatted by a fascist," I told him. He's the one that was itching for a fight. It didn't used to be so bad. A flash of sadness danced through his deep brown eyes. "Maramark used to be a laughing stock, full of fringe nutcases. Now they're one of the biggest gangs in Galtiska. People are angry," I replied. "A lot of them are just angry at the wrong people. We all know that the really sick and twisted criminals are the ones who shat out that god-awful remake of Professor Falconbond." Zayden smirked, pinching a chip out of my polystyrene tub. "Don't even go there," I laughed. "I have literally been shot, and it was less painful than that reeking fucking dumpster fire of a show." "You've been shot?" Zayden asked, with a cold soberness that didn't quite manage to mask his curiosity. I pushed up my fringe, pointing to the dark circle on my otherwise pale forehead. "Savashi soldiers when I was 7, I told him, leaving out the part where they'd also killed my dad. I didn't want to put a downer on the mood, and I certainly wasn't looking for sympathy. Showing your new friend the cool scar you got is like the morbid version of the kid who brings a shiny new trading card to the playground. Going into needless detail about your dead dad is like the kid who takes the blades out of their pencil sharpeners to see if anyone gives a shit." I rolled up the sleeve of my jacket, proudly showing the deep white scar on my left arm with a little hair toss for dramatic effect. "That's from a knife-wielding gorilla during the Battle of Saltsemen," I told him, with a little theatrical flair. "The rebels called themselves Quay 10. It means immortal warriors in Varinian, having killed about 12 of the bastards. I can assure you they were very fucking mortal. I told that joke every time I showed someone my war wounds, but I wasn't above rehashing old material. Zayden shot me a look that told me I'd done something wrong. Zavashi soldiers shot you in the head when you were a kid. Then you fought on their side in the Varinia uprising. Not because I'm a patriot, I told him. I stopped myself from saying I just really like killing people. I figured that wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. By the mercy of the gods, we were interrupted when a soft, delicate voice began to bleed in through the chippies' rattling speakers. Holy shit, Zayden laughed excitedly. Is that Emyr Morgan? It was. The multi-talented actor who had risen to fame in Gultiska for playing Commandant Gefzan in Professor Falconpont had also been a fucking incredible singer. The Keveru party had done everything that they could to scrub that era of Gultiska from the history books, but my people still engaged in quiet acts of rebellion, like playing the music of one of Gultiska's greatest performers. Zayden and I sat in silence for a moment, gleefully basking in the gentle wonder of Emyr's soothing voice. We stepped out of the chippy, an ocean of garish white lights flickering through the night like candles piercing darkness. Werden was truly beautiful after the sun had set. Each window, storefront and lamppost glowing like crystals twinkling on a dazzling chandelier, cutting through the blackness and leaving wispy trails of ethereal light floating through the air. An icy wind was blowing ferociously against us as we ambled down filthy Stone Street, which was very much working in my favour because my greasy mountain of chips had left me with the chronic need to fart. You live near here? Zayden asked me, puffing on a Super King. A ghostly thread of grey smoke wafted back over his shoulders. Not really, Morris, but I can grab a taxi. Zayden stared at me blankly. I'm Zayden? He gave me a puzzled look. Who's Morris? I grunted in frustration. Sorry, Zayden, I corrected myself. Morris is just some grumpy fossil I work with. I don't know why he's on my mind. I was lying. The tempestuous anger I felt towards Pranav and Old Man Morris was still rumbling inside of me. I hated Pranav for being a stuck-up cunt, and I hated Old Man Morris for getting to keep his underprivileged client, whilst I had to hang mine out to dry. His ugly, wrinkled face had been munching and crunching on my thoughts all evening. Looking back, I think I probably called the bartender Morris at one point as well. He'd done something to piss you off? Zayden asked me, taking another drag from his tray. There's this woman, I explained. Nia Morris. Fuck! Howell! Nia Howell! I slapped myself in the face, then instantly regretted it as a sharp stab of hot pain exploded out of my sore cheek. Basically, this sweet old woman is going to die because my boss is a pus-filled vaginal wart, but my bumbling bed-blocker colleague and his slaggertron client are going to be completely fine because Codger and Cockmuncher cost my company less money, I explained briskly, despite having only known me for a few hours. Zayden once again hit me with one of his disapproving looks. It made me feel like a naughty child who was being scolded by their teacher. Shouldn't you be angry at your boss, not your colleague? The dark-skinned young man asked me. Also, don't you think slut-shaming is a little yucky? I threw up my arms in exasperation. I'm angry at everyone, I screamed in frustration. This world is full of fucking boy, you! I was cut off by the gravelly bellowing of a voice that had become vexingly familiar. Alwyn the angry ogre came charging out of the darkness, clutching a thick metal pipe in both brawny hands. He absolutely towered over us, like a skyscraper bursting out of an ocean of one-story flats. Ain't nobody to save you now, he growled, fingers coiling around the bulky pipe, whilst a hateful string of slurs and curses exploded out of his mouth. Get repent, you infected chode, I screeched back at him, all of my pent-up rage rushing out in a tidal wave of hate. We were on the streets now, and pepper spray wasn't going to be enough to bring this rampaging racist down. I pulled Victoria out of my handbag, drawing comfort from the firmness of her shaft in my hand, her long curved blade shimmering beneath the pale gaze of the full moon. Zayden surprised me by slipping a retractable baton out of his jacket, unsheathing it with a satisfying click. The way the black baton gleamed in the moonlight told me it was made from sleek metal. Alwyn roared, "Aman swin, Dunawir, Huna Kalama," at us. My Galtis rig is pretty rusty, but I knew the ancient Galtiscan battle cry that was thrown around by everyone from well-meaning history buffs to bloodthirsty fascists. It meant something like reject the individual, embrace the empire, or no self, only empire. I can't remember the specifics. No, I don't know why racists had glommed onto it as one of their many shitty slogans. Adrenaline ignited inside of me. I was incredibly aware that if Alwyn hit me first, I probably wouldn't get a chance to hit back. My atrocious diet had given me a not inconsiderable bit of bulk, but he was absolutely slabbered in muscle and about a foot taller than me. I needed to hit first, and I needed to do it quickly. Alwyn charged at Zayden, assuming that the man with a baton was more of a threat than the woman with a knife. Fuck it. For once, misogyny was working in my favour. Zayden slammed his riot stick into Alwyn's rock-hard chest, but it didn't even make the gargantuan fascist slow down. My new drinking buddy ducked below a wild swing of Alwyn's pipe, dodging it by an absolute hair's breadth. Zayden was a small man, but he was zipping about quickly. There was no stumbling or hesitancy in his movements. Whether it was street smarts or formal training, Zayden obviously had some kind of fighting background. Alwyn raised his pipe above his stocky head, readying himself to bring it screaming down at Zayden. My new friend moved like a crack of lightning, thrusting his elbow powerfully into the angry ogre's nose. Twin jets of blood spurted out of the crumbled heap of Alwyn's nose, spraying dark carmine across his face. Alwyn stumbled backwards, and I saw my opening. I called upon the burning furnace of hate that churned and roared within my core, letting conscious thought give way to the impulses of a warrior. I rushed forwards, drawing upon every single iota of strength in my body, and buried Victoria's blade deep into Alwyn's side. Metal tore through flesh and muscle, embedding itself in my opponent with a satisfying squelch. That was celestial music to my ears. Alwyn let out a gasp, stumbling to his knees. Blood was dribbling out of his nose and gushing out of where I'd stabbed him with Victoria. I was in heaven. I hadn't had this much fun since the Trangal massacre. Much like I could care less, and are you going to pay for that? This is a phrase that gets thrown around far too much by annoying cunts, but in this next instance, I feel pretty justified in saying nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Alwyn was on his knees, covered in his own blood, with Victoria's blade sticking out of his side. I felt quite safe in my assertion that the fight was over. "Here's an inferior race now, dickhead!" Zayden half screamed, half whooped at the blood-soaked fascist. "Nicely done." I shot my drinking buddy a smirk, and we bumped our fists together. Alwyn stared at us with blank, empty eyes. It was like even the most fringe thoughts had been whisked right out of his head. His features were utterly devoid of expression, and he reminded me of a clockwork toy that needed to be wound up. A sharp crack of bone tore through the night, reverberating off of stone streets and empty buildings. Bewilderment seized control of me whilst I watched 5 sets of long, pale claws burst out of the flesh of Alwyn's hand. His mouth lolled open, and I gazed on in horror as his teeth began to stretch into hook-like fangs. I heard Zayden curse under his breath. Owen rose up off of his knees, coiled talons tearing through the hard leather of his shoes. His already humongous body seemed to be swelling, like there was a swarm of wriggling maggots threshing and writhing just beneath his skin. The wounded body of our opponent began to twist and jerk, each uncanny movement accompanied by a shrill snap of bone. His legs jutted out at an angle that shouldn't be possible, deep contortions warping them until they looked like the back legs of a feral hound. His jaw distended forward, ripping through the flesh of his face in a mess of dark blood and gristle. A dark, gooey mixture of saliva and gore dripped down from his fanged maw, splattering onto the ground in congealed puddles. I had seen a staggering amount of atrocity and horror in my relatively brief life, but even I had no way of making sense of what was happening right in front of me. What remained of Owen's flesh became taut and papery, pulled tight around the bulge of his bones. Eyes that had once been blue now blazed with wrathful fire, streams of volcanic red and crackling orange burning inside his irises. The beast raised itself up, standing taller than any man I had ever seen, and an ear-splitting screech boomed out of its jaws. I had forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. My time as a mercenary had washed away my fear and imbued me with this sense that I was some kind of untouchable, all-powerful killing machine for the first time since I was a little girl. I felt real, icy dread rushing through me. Hello. The thing that had been Owen said with a terrifying titter of laughter. I have so been looking forward to meeting you, Bethan. Dread pounded inside me like blood. I took a terrified step away from the creature that had been Owen, my feet floundering shakily beneath me. The beast leered, flashing a mouthful of spine-chilling fangs. The way it said darling was horrifically similar to how Dad had spoken. Don't listen to it, Bethan, I heard Zayden shout. Don't let it in your head. What the fuck are you? I stammered, my usual cocksure bluster melting beneath the wave of terror that had come crashing down on top of me. The monster replied with a twisted smirk. And I have had my own for a very long time. My brain was racing to make sense of the impossible creature that loomed over me, a sadistic sneer curling its monstrous features. My blessed days have seen the darkness in your mind, Bethan. The thing that had been Alwyn told me. I have seen the past keeping away from the rest of the world. I have seen your black weight apart. I know you love your fellow humans. I have tasted your disgust, your insanity and your greed. I find him delicious. I was freezing up as if I'd been entombed in creeping ice. My limbs were locked in place, and there was nothing I could do to thaw them. You're not real, I blabbered, sweat caking my forehead. Oh, but I am. The monster cackled back at me. I'm as real as the stones beneath your feet and the sky above your head. I'm as real as the burning evil that burns inside you, like a volcano. The creature's searing red eyes fixed upon me. I can't tell you how long I've waited for one like you. The thing that had called itself an angel grinned at me. One for the burst into your uncontrollable darkness. Ignore it, Bethan, Zayden shouted once more. These things thrive on our doubts and insecurities. If you don't feed it with your fear, it will starve. I don't want your fear, the monster told me. I want your hatred. You want the hunger and the malice that separate you from all the worthless bloodsuckers. Your evil is so beautiful, Bethan. The creature was right in front of me now. It loomed above me like a gnarled tree, whilst I stayed locked in place and utterly helpless. My mind scrambled to conjure coherent thoughts, but all that thrashed about in my skull was a frantic mess of half-formed ideas that were so riddled with hot, burning fear that I could no more make sense of them than I could sprout wings. The being declared. My foster mother, Victoria, used to tell me bedtime stories about Emyr Morgan, her supposedly cannibal ancestor, who old Galtiscan legends claim bathed in the blood of her victims. For reasons I can understand, when the creature that loomed above me said, Ragora, the same dark, sadistic glee that I had drawn from those twisted tales began to oscillate inside of me. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the night. It sounded like an especially noisy rat being shoved into a wood chipper. The being stumbled away from me, shrieking and howling in pain, whilst it clutched at a gaping hole in its emaciated chest. Streaks of thick, inky mist were floating out of the crater that had been blown straight through its body, and its warped sneer had melted into an agonized wail. Zayden was holding what looked like a flare that was spitting out a blindingly bright light, the colour of rich silver. The flaming rod burned with a stunning swirl of sizzling grey and pale white fire, hissing and cracking as it spluttered out searing embers. That won't keep it at bay for long, he shouted, grabbing my hand. We need to get the fuck out of here. As we sprinted off down a maze of spiralling streets and coiling back alleys, we ran beneath a crumbling brick wall with "The End Begins" sprayed across it. What the fuck was that thing? I screamed at Zayden once we'd finally stopped running. A tildrake, he replied, whilst huffing and puffing for breath. They were the natives of Galtiska before the humans arrived. We thought they'd faded into legend, but recently more of the fuckers have been popping up. We think something is climbing back into the spotlight. Zayden and I had taken shelter in a dingy little side street, surrounded by walls made from faded onyx bricks. Who the fuck is we? I squawked at him like a shrill parrot. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was not presenting my usual cool, detached persona. Being accosted by some kind of horrifying boogeyman straight from a story made to frighten the shit out of children had gotten me somewhat rattled. I was amazed at how quickly I found myself accepting that I had just had an encounter with a hideous nightmare demon that would make even the most badass of motherfuckers crap their trousers, when it was far more likely somebody had slipped something especially awful into my drink. My rational mind was telling me that I was the victim of attempted date rape via magic mushrooms, whilst the primal, instinctive part of my lizard brain was assuring me that I had in fact crossed paths with a genuine monster. Maybe that cold, ancient part of my genetic makeup remembered a time before science and reason, when we were prey, not predators. Maybe the tildrake were the last remnants of some prehistoric era dominated by supernatural monstrosities so horrifying that mankind had tried desperately to forget them. I'm part of a group that deals with shit like this, Zayden said somewhat cryptically. This ain't my first rodeo. I blinked slowly at my new drinking buddy. Did you know that Alwyn was a freaky sleeper creeper? I asked him. I genuinely had no idea, he told me. The tildrake burrow into people like parasites and can sit dormant for as long as they want. They're drawn towards intense, destructive emotions, be that fear, depression, hate, or even people with poor impulse control. The first one I came across was hidden inside a heroin-addicted tramp. Say that thing probably chose Alwyn because he was overflowing with rage and intolerance, I asked. Zayden nodded. The Tildrake love a bigot, he explained. Somebody festering with that special blend of unfounded paranoia and fury is like a succulent buffet to them. I took a long moment to process what he was saying. That thing called me the Agora, I recalled. What does that mean? Zayden shrugged, shooting me a sympathetic look. I genuinely have no idea, he admitted. The Tildrake don't usually hang around to chat. I've never seen one take an interest in somebody like they did with you. Even experts like us know precious little about the Tildrake. That was the furthest thing from comforting. Zayden, a stern voice sliced through the night. I saw the silver light from one of the smoke sticks. What happened? Did you encounter one of the entities? I spun around on my heel and was greeted by the face of a woman I thought I'd never see again. Isolde Balvercroft was as stone-faced and muscular as ever, with skin the colour of luscious honey. What was new was the metallic prosthetic that seemed to have replaced her right arm at the elbow, coated in thick steel plates and fringed in a web of sleek wires. I'm not the most observant of people, but I'm pretty sure she had 2 arms the last time I'd seen her. Major Balvercroft, I greeted her with a raised eyebrow. You're missing an arm. Captain Turner Wickruth. She shot back in her sharp, militaristic manner. You're fit. Fuck! I didn't have a cutting retort for that. Give me 15 minutes of quiet seething and I'm sure I could have come up with something snappy. You and Bethan know each other? Zayden asked the Major. We were both working for Sifrave during the Civil War in Xiaohaoyan, Isolde said dryly. She should have been court-martialed after the Trangao massacre, but instead she got a promotion. Major Isolde Balvercroft was the walking embodiment of everything I hated. She was a dreary marionette of a woman, suspended by strings made from her own ridiculous notions of honour and morality. Her ludicrous sense of ethics was utterly at odds with the reality of serving in a war zone, and she had spent our time in Xiaohaoyan taking every opportunity to stop me from doing my job, or from engaging in the sort of beautiful carnage that flooded my brain with a rush of twinkling endorphins. I rolled my eyes. Of course you're still butthurt about that, I scoffed. War is hell, Major. Bad things happen. That wasn't war, Isolde snarled at me. That was the slaughter of unarmed civilians. A slaughter that you reveled in. You're a disgusting sociopath and a war criminal. But I was exonerated of any wrongdoing, wasn't I? A smirk yanked at the corner of my lips as I spoke. The siege of Trangao won us the war. Isolde's brown eyes burrowed into me, brimming with hate and revulsion. And now Generalissimo Wolfgang and his gang of bloodthirsty tyrants have turned Xiaohaoyan into a totalitarian hellhole, which they've used to flood the world with speed, Major Balvercroft replied. I'm sure you're incredibly proud. You're just as culpable as I am, Isolde. I laughed bluntly back at her. Remind me who called in the drone strike on Guangzhou? What was the death toll there, pray tell? Guangzhou was a military target. Major Balvercroft practically spat at me. Trangao was ruthless butchery. And now you and this mysterious twink are running around fighting ooky spooky scary fuckers, I said with a hint of inquisitiveness. If I hadn't seen the bloody thing myself, I'd call this a shit horror movie. You've accepted the existence of the Tildrake far quicker than I did, Isolde admitted. Most people just can't wrap their heads around them and write them off as old superstitions. They thrive on it. It's so much easier for them to prey on us if we refuse to accept that they're real. Yeah, well, I guess I've seen enough craziness in life that these Tildrake aren't completely implausible, I replied. So what are you guys then? Monster hunters? Something like that. Zayden let out a muted laugh. We're members of an organization that was created to monitor and combat the Tildrake threat. Before the Great Revolution, we were an extension of the government, but since Ketherud took over, we've become more
Freelance.
Are you a bunch of smelly freedom fighters holed up in your uncle's shed? I asked.
I'm glad that you find this amusing, Captain Turner-Wick Ruth.
Isolde was grinding her jaw while she glowered at me.
But some of us have aspirations beyond making money and killing people. If we didn't exist, Goldiskar would have been overrun by the Tildrake a long time ago.
Yeah, well, Zayden and I bumped into a Tildrake, so you're doing a pretty shit job, I replied.
We're stretched thin, and our resources are depleted,
Zayden argued.
We're doing the best we can with what's at our disposal.
I clapped my hands together. I wish you all the best in your glorious crusade against the ugly-bugly monsters that spunked their way out of hell's dickhole, but this is where I get off the ride, I declared. I've got to be at the office for an 8:30 start and I need my beauty sleep. Zayden stared at me in disbelief.
Seriously?
He spluttered. You're not in the least bit curious about the nightmare entity that we both saw. Sure, but I'm not curious enough that I want to actively get involved in whatever fuckery you're up to, I told him. I'm sure that you and Major Menstrual Mary have got it covered.
Even with what you've seen, you're just gonna bugger off.
Yep. I shot him a thumbs up. I don't really see what I could do to help.
You're a soldier.
Zayden let out an exasperated huff. I was a soldier, I corrected him. Now I'm a claims processor.
You are never a soldier.
Major Balvercroft scowled at me with blatant disgust.
You've only ever been a murderer.
As much as the military-industrial complex would love you to believe there's a distinction, there really isn't. I shrugged my shoulders. Life isn't going to reward you with cosmic good goal points because you only shot at people with guns, Isolde.
You really don't care that there are genuine fucking monsters out there, snatching people up off of our streets?
Zayden continued to ramble angrily at me. I didn't care this morning when I knew that there were traffickers abducting little girls and shithead landlords throwing single mums out into the cold, I replied. Why would it make a difference knowing that there are literal monsters as well as the figurative ones in Goldiskar? You'd be amazed at how peaceful life is when you don't waste your time getting your knickers in a twist over bullshit that doesn't concern you.
Sith never should have let you wear their armor.
Major Balvercroft's lips curled with revulsion.
Oh, fuck off,
I groaned. We were mercenaries. We were hired killers. If you're going to sulk about the injustice of it all, you should have picked a different job. The trams had stopped running, so I walked until I found a taxi stand. I was sat in the back of a black cab when Griff called me. What? I snapped sharply as I answered my phone. Griff's voice came through as a wobbly whisper. I could tell he'd been crying.
I want to go to bed, but you're not here.
His voice cracked as he spoke.
I can't sleep when you're not here. It doesn't feel right.
Something about hearing him in such tangible pain cut through my defenses. I felt my voice softening as I replied. I just went out for a drink. I tried to reassure him. I'll be home soon. Griff didn't need to say it for me to know that he was worried I'd been shagging around.
Please come home,
he said weakly. I will, sweetheart, I said. I'm on my way home right now. There was a long pause.
I don't like it when you hit me,
he whimpered.
It makes me feel really nasty.
I felt my heart drop into the pit of my stomach. I know, I replied, an ever so faint crack marring my words. I'm sorry. I'm really fucking sorry.
Will you be home soon?
He asked me. Yeah, I replied. I'll see you very soon.
I love you,
he snivelled. I love you too, my sweet boy, I told him. Griff and I fucked for the first time in weeks. I didn't know how else to show him I was sorry, as I lay there limp and uninterested, with him grunting and thrusting on top of me. I remember wondering why I am the way that I am. It was something that danced through my mind an awful lot. Perhaps because there were so many potential answers. Even before I was shot in the head, my childhood had been far from ideal. After Dad died, I was adopted by Victoria, who was such a bizarre and vivacious woman that anybody she raised was never going to be normal. Then Then, of course, there were my 3 years as a gun for hire. It stood to reason that killing people for a living would have an impact on the spindly wires of my brain. I was deep in thought, bed springs creaking beneath me, when I whacked my head against our shoddy wooden headboard. "Are you okay?" Griff asked, sweaty and heaving for breath. My instinct was to call him a pillock, but I managed to bite my tongue. "I'm fine, babe," I said with a forced smile. "If you're hurt, we can stop," my boyfriend told me nervously. Honestly, I'm fine," I assured him. "Keep going." I hated that he was tiptoeing on eggshells around me, but that was also entirely my own fault, so I was going to have to suck it up and do what I could to knock down some of those walls. I was on my best behaviour. I was going to be a good girlfriend. Until further notice, Captain Turner Whitgrove was on ass-kissing duty. The next morning, I sneakily ordered 2 tickets for us to see Unmedicated Apocalypse before I headed to work. Griff and I had met at a UA gig, and my methodical brain told me that that was the sort of sweet gesture that normal humans would extend to their partners when they had a lot of grovelling to do. A tiny glint of warmth twinkled inside of me. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I felt good, but I felt a little more at ease. I've always been inhuman, but in my own inhuman way, I was trying to be a better person for Griff. I guess that I'd gotten so used to feeling like an outsider that I'd never dared to hope that I could be any kind of normal. Maybe Griff was my chance for normalcy. Maybe he could give me the chance to see what it was like to be accepted, or even loved, by the herd. As much as I craved the thrill of danger and uncertainty, I realized that there was at least a part of me that hoped for comfort and security. It occurred to me then that I knew what I wanted out of people. I had only ever felt warmth inside of me when I was hurting others or stuffing myself full of drugs. I knew what I had secretly hoped for. I wanted to find people that made me feel like drugs did. I was very much aware that I still had to call Nia Howell and tell her that Ramakadash had decided to fuck her over. I managed to distract myself by blasting Unmedicated Apocalypse through my headphones and bopping along as I took the tram to work. An old git who looked like a withered corpse angrily tapped me on the shoulder. "Your music is much too loud," he huffed and grumbled at me. "You're going to damage your ears." "Touch me again, and I'll rip your face off and staple it to your chest, you prehistoric cunt," I replied with my most chipper smile stretched across my lips. The rest of the ride to work passed without incident. I had only just squeezed into my office chair and booted up my computer when the shadow of Big Boss Pranav fell over me. "I'm just about to call Nia," I told the frustratingly handsome bellend who ran our office. "Put the brakes on that," he commanded. "There's somebody you need to speak to first." I tried to read Pranav's expression, but the look of confusion on his features told me that he was as perplexed as I was. Our boss was a haughty, boastful man who loved the sound of his own voice as much as he loved taking sharp-tongued pot shots at his employees. The fact that he was using brisk sentences instead of his usual rambling monologues was a blatant sign that something was off. "I don't have any appointments until midday," I told him. I know, but Pranav screwed up his face as if he was struggling to string the words together. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "It's Grand Viceroy Majafahat." My brain short-circuited like it was a poorly made robot. I shot him a... "Is this a joke? Look, I legitimately have no idea what's going on," Pranav admitted, "but the Grand Viceroy and 2 members of the Royal Guard are waiting for you in meeting room C." My head spun, as if a pair of invisible hands were shaking me about like a spray can. In days of yore, Gortiska was ruled over by our old royal family, the Fedwiz. After the Shadow War, the dire state of our economy spurred on the Great Revolution, and Gortiska had briefly been governed by the Commodore Party. What followed was a period that history remembered as the Terror, when Zavashi had annexed us to stop the Commodore Party from allying Gortiska with the People's Union of Hestasilla. Ever since the Zavashi occupation, Gortiska had been governed by a Grand Viceroy, directly appointed by the High Chancellor of Zavashi's Kefiru Party. Grand Viceroy Pritiara Majafahat was the current ruler of Gortiska. And apparently, she wanted to talk to me. The Grand Viceroy was waiting for me in meeting room C, flanked by 2 royal guards who were clad in purple armor fringed with gleaming gold. I felt as if I had been plunged into an icy pool as I took a seat opposite her. It was like she sucked all of the warmth out of the room and replaced it with a ravenous, icy abyss that fed on heat and happiness.
"Good morning, Miss Turner Wickroof,"
the Grand Viceroy said in a voice that was a smooth, cold whisper.
"Thank you for taking the time to meet with me."
Grand Viceroy Majafahad had the ageless complexion of one of those annoying people who can be anything from 30 to 50. Her skin was smooth, her eyes small, and she had a life build that was punctuated by the bulge of hard muscle. I had seen her face and heard her voice countless times before, but now she was a real, tangible being who was sat in the same room as me. The Grand Viceroy was the living embodiment of the Kefaru Party's will in Gultiska, and the physical manifestation of the imperialistic ideals that so many of my people zealously hated. "Good morning, Grand Viceroy," I managed to say, my head still whirling. "How can I help you?" Pritiara Majafard's hair was styled in a militaristic bun, and her expression was utterly neutral. She didn't smile or frown, and it was nigh on impossible for me to read her mood. I was usually a deft hand analysing somebody's expression, yet the Grand Viceroy gave nothing away.
"The photos I have seen of you didn't do your eyes justice,"
she told me. I blinked in confusion. "Sorry?"
"The photographs didn't capture how vividly green they are," she continued. "Such a vibrant color, like emeralds, like the green of the Gultiskan flag. Little details like that get lost in photographs."
Unsure of how to respond, I cleared my throat. Was there a threat veiled between her words? Was she trying to say that she had been studying me, that she knew all about me, without just coming out and saying it? Her tone was perfectly polite and her mannerisms were hardly aggressive, yet there was an undeniable aura of menace to the Grand Viceroy that seemed to thrum in the air around her. "How can I help you?" I simply repeated.
"I want to talk to you about last night,"
Pritiara explained, wasting no more time with pleasantries.
"and your encounter with the Tildrake."
I'm not trying to sound tough when I say that people very rarely make me anxious. Empty threats and conceited bluster are like water off of a duck's back for me. In spite of all that, there was something incredibly unsettling about being in the Grand Viceroy's presence. This was a feeling that was almost utterly unfamiliar to me. As a child, I had definitely fallen into the bully category rather than the victim one, and my time as a hired gun had only increased my perception of myself as a fearless badass. Was the discomfort that the Grand Viceroy elicited from me anything like the dread that I had inspired within the other kids at school? I am still wrapping my head around them, I confided in Pritiara. I had no idea that the Tildrake existed before last night.
"There are many secrets and mysteries in this world, which don't fit into our narrow view of an orderly, purely scientific existence,"
the Grand Viceroy said to me.
"Last night, you became privy to one such secret."
I didn't need to ask how the Grand Viceroy knew about what had happened. Gultiska was absolutely swimming in spies and security cameras.
"The existence of the Tildrake is strictly classified, but I see no point in trying to maintain a lie when you've personally witnessed one,"
the Grand Viceroy explained.
"What interests me is the unusual way that the Tildrake interacted with you."
Uneasiness fluctuated in my chest like a roller coaster zooming up and down. The Grand Viceroy seemed to exude an aura of utter authority, without ever needing to raise her voice or bark commands. She struck me as the sort of person who did not bend to the whims of the world, but rather bent the world around her. Somebody like that, being intimately familiar with my comings and goings, was a deeply troubling thought. "I don't really know anything about these creatures, Grand Viceroy," I told her. "I'm afraid that I can't help you there." The Grand Viceroy stared at me with a composed countenance that served as a barrier between me and her thoughts.
"The Tildrake are a crucial component in an undertaking of mine here in Gultiska, yet their aggressive nature makes them especially difficult to communicate with.
The Grand Viceroy told me.
The Tildraig usually attack humans on sight, but they appear to treat you in a far less combative manner. That is of immense interest to me.
A spark of peculiar pride sputtered inside my chest. I genuinely don't have an explanation to offer you, Grand Viceroy, I told her. I'm utterly clueless. I had expected the Grand Viceroy to have said, please call me Pretty Aura by now. Yet she seemed to prefer me using her formal title when addressing her. Everything from the crisp state of her clothes, her decorous way of speaking, and her soldierly posture told me that Britiara Majafat was a woman who favoured formality over ease. Pinned to her breast was a golden badge, depicting the sigil of the Ketharu party. A roaring tiger.
Our understanding of the Tildraig is woefully limited, but I have studied what we do know about them a great detail,
the Grand Viceroy said, her royal guard still standing behind her like imposing statues.
As such, the significance of the fact that the Tildraig called you Thuragora is not lost on me.
That piqued my interest. There was a surprising power in the phrase Ragora, like even uttering it was a defiance against some unspoken rule. Every time it was spoken, an almost imperceptible tremble seemed to go shuddering through the air. What is the Ragora? I asked her. The Grand Viceroy was as stoic and rigid as her royal guards, devoid of even the faintest twitch or quirk of body language.
From what I can ascertain from examining ancient Tildraig art, the Ragora is a prophesized bridge between humans and the Tildraig.
The Grand Viceroy told me.
A being who was born human, yet possesses the qualities of a Tildraig.
A mixture of contrasting thoughts began to swim around in my head. On one side, it probably wasn't a great sign that a species of dark and terrible monsters had found kinship with me, but on the other hand, I felt a slight twitch of pride. I'd always wanted somebody to tell me that I was better than other people, in some capacity, and the notion that I may be some kind of venerated chosen one did give me a small rush of exhilaration. How does that help you? I asked the Grand Viceroy.
I need to establish a clear line of communication with the Tildraig,
the Grand Viceroy told me.
I believe that you are the key to accomplishing that, Miss Turner Wickruth.
There was something predatory in Britiara's gaze, like the glint of hunger in a lion's eyes before it pounces on a gazelle. The Grand Viceroy held all of the cards, and she knew it. Do I get a say in what happens next, or are you going to abduct me regardless? I asked her. For the first time since I'd met her, an exceptionally faint smirk tugged on the corner of Britiara's lips.
I would prefer it if you followed willingly,
the Grand Viceroy said.
But I am not engaging in petty gloating when I say that the only authority above me in Gultiska is the High Chancellor. One way or another, you will be coming with me.
I endeavored to hide my emotions via a neutral expression, just as Britiara was. You don't beat about the bush, I told her.
I imagine you of all people can appreciate that,
the Grand Viceroy replied.
Your facade of normalcy is impressive, but not without flaws. I know what you are, Miss Turner Wickruth.
And how do you know that? I asked her.
Because you're just like me,
said the Grand Viceroy. I told the Grand Viceroy that I needed to grab some essentials before we left and quickly nip back to my desk before I was swept off on whatever mysterious mission Britiara had in mind. I figured it was worth having some kind of emergency escape plan. I kept Victoria and my canister of pepper spray in my handbag at all times, but there was another sneaky little surprise that was stashed in my desk. Reasonably concerned that man-child Matthew would snap and shoot up the office, I kept an especially nasty explosive called a hellfire grenade hidden in my old Professor Falconpond lunchbox. Hellfire grenades are one of the trademarks of the Hazavat Corporation, a weapons manufacturer who are infamous for creating some of the most lethal and inhumane armaments on the market. No, I had not acquired my hellfire grenade through legal means. I tucked the explosive into the bottom of my handbag, then went to rejoin Pritiara. If Big Boss Pranav had an issue with the Grand Viceroy whisking me away from work, he had the good sense to keep his complaints to himself. Pritiara's royal guards guided us to a heavily armoured car that looked like a squat block of black metal, and it wasn't long until we were zooming away from the office. A driver in an especially snappy uniform sat behind the wheel, whilst the Grand Viceroy and I were in the back, sandwiched between her two royal guards. I was close enough to the Grand Viceroy that I could smell the strong, woody scent of her perfume. The aroma was light enough that I knew she'd applied it sparsely, yet still strong enough for me to pick up small whiffs of its bold, timbered fragrance. A distinctive smell for a distinctive woman.
I read your file.
Grand Viceroy Pritiara Majafat told me, after about 15 minutes of unbroken silence.
I know that Sivashi's soldiers killed your father.
A quiet flicker of fury twisted in my gut. I had no desire to talk to a stranger about Dad, especially not one as prominent in the Kefiru party as Pritiara. That was a long time ago, I replied briskly.
The day he was killed, Gultiskans were marching in protest of the murder of Harry Aubrey at Fegwa internment camp.
The Grand Viceroy continued.
Harry and his associates had been put in Fegwa in response to the GLA destroying a truck that was transporting Savashi soldiers.
I know, I said curtly. I would rather have gotten sodomized with a chainsaw than continue having that conversation with her.
My mother was on that truck.
The Grand Viceroy replied without so much as a hint of emotion.
Her name was Lieutenant Rani Majafat.
That piqued my curiosity. The Grand Viceroy was very much in the public eye, but I'd never heard that story before. Is that public knowledge? I asked her.
It isn't a secret,
she replied.
But I've never felt the need to use my past to grovel for sympathy with the party. I'm the Grand Viceroy because of my accomplishments, not because of any perceived personal tragedies.
If she was trying to build some kind of solidarity with me, then she was wildly off the mark. I wasn't about to become best friends with the newest architect of Gultiska's oppression. Your mother's death doesn't justify what happened to my father, I bluntly told her. Majafat's mother was a soldier. She had known she was stepping onto a battlefield when she joined the army. My dad had been a factory worker. He'd never knowingly invited war into our lives.
Nothing in life is justified,
the Grand Viceroy replied in her customarily cool and toneless voice.
Destiny and morality are empty constructs, used to bring order into a world of chaos. Things don't happen for a reason. They just happen.
Pritiara Majafat was as difficult to read as ever. Her expression betrayed absolutely nothing, and her body language remained militaristically firm. So much of what I said and did was built upon studying the behaviour of others, as was a necessity when one wants to hide their weirdness. Yet the Grand Viceroy was continuing to present an impossible obstacle. Why tell me about your mother? I asked her.
I just thought it was a curious coincidence,
Pritiara replied.
How the actions of others, completely out of our control, linked our lives in such a significant way.
It isn't a coincidence, I bristled, speaking with a perhaps unwise lack of diplomacy. Sivashi invaded Gultiska, and Gultiska fought back. That isn't coincidence, that's direct cause and effect.
Sivashi would never have set foot in Gultiska if the Commodores hadn't made plans to ally themselves with Hester Silla.
The Grand Viceroy countered.
Our country spent 7 years fighting the People's Union of Hester Silla together. Then Gultiska sought to merge with our hated enemy. If you're looking for who is culpable, look to the Commodore Party, not Kefiru.
It sounded to me as if Marjafad was trying to absolve Sivashi of any of the blame from the countless atrocities they had committed against Gultiska, and that really got me riled up. Sivashi were the villains. There was no fucking way I was going to let her make it out like the occupation was our fault. The Commodore Party didn't drop a nuke on us, I hissed back at Pretiara. I don't expect a pampered bourgeois princess to understand why we looked to Hester Silla after the Shadow War turned our country into a poverty-infested rubbish heap. For the second time since I'd met her, an uncanny smile flitted across the Grand Viceroy's lips.
Bourgeois,
she mimicked with a soft laugh.
Victoria Wickroof played such a crucial role in your upbringing, yet those faint splinters of your father still poke through the polite society guise she equipped you with. It seems that the blue-blooded aristocrat couldn't wash away the influence of the blue-collar union man.
The presence of the two armed guards was the only thing stopping me from grabbing that arrogant cunt by her hair and smashing her face into the seat in front of me. We aren't a curiosity for you to ogle out like beasts in a zoo, I snarled. We are sentient, living people.
So are the people of Trangao,
the Grand Viceroy replied. We spent the next few hours in silence. Eventually, the urban sprawl of dull grey buildings gave way into the verdant green of the countryside. We drove through a thicket of towering trees and rolling fields. The Grand Viceroy and I locked in an uncomfortable silence. Gazing out of one of the armoured car's windows, a flash of familiarity blinked inside of me when I spotted a thick-set oak with the decrepit remains of a rickety tree house nestled in its hefty branches. That's my treehouse, I murmured with realization.
We're bound for Emyr Manor,
the Grand Viceroy told me.
Your guardian's old home.
Emyr Manor had been the ancestral home of the ancient House Wickroof since the earliest days of the Gultiskan Empire. By the time Victoria died of lung cancer, House Wickroof had crumbled into ruin and poverty. There was no way I could afford to keep hold of the manor, so I sold it right before I joined the Sithwraith mercenary company. Saying goodbye to Emyr Manor had felt like someone had thrust their hand into my ribcage and torn my heart out. I had so many cherished memories of those winding halls and cavernous rooms. Stepping into the manor after 7 years growing up on the grimy streets of Worden's East End was like being whisked away into a fairy tale. Letting go of the manor had felt like waking up from a beautiful dream and being pulled back into the bleak horror of reality. Is this some kind of sick game? I snapped at the Grand Viceroy. Why are you bringing me back here?
The Tildrake are drawn to powerful emotions,
the Grand Viceroy told me in her frustratingly blank voice.
If we're going to contact them, it stands to reason that somewhere you have a strong emotional connection to is the most practical place to do so.
Hot anger was teeming and burning beneath my flesh. Don't assume that reading a few files about my life means you know who I am, I sneered back at Pretiara. You don't know shit about me. A cruel, icy smirk tugged gently at the Grand Viceroy's thin lips.
Marja Jankowski,
the Grand Viceroy said plainly. I felt as if she had grabbed me by the throat. What? I spluttered, my mind racing desperately to create a facade of calmness.
You and Miss Jankowski were close, weren't you?
The Grand Viceroy verbally prodded me.
Best friends. Some would say closer than best friends. Her death must have wounded you.
Marja Jankowski had come from an immigrant family from Russia who moved to Gultiska when I was a preteen. From the day we met, Marja and I were inseparable. We were two hellraisers cut from the same cloth. We grew from children into teenagers, becoming more and more intertwined with each passing year. It was fucking horrible, yeah, I blabbered. I lost Marja, then I lost Victoria, then I lost Emyr Manor. It was a really fucking horrible year. What's your point? I could feel old wounds splitting open, sending spikes of icy sorrow and boiling rage lancing through my innards. I felt like a bear that had been blasted by a hunter's shotgun, a smoking crater turning my entrails into a bloody ruin. I hadn't realised how much I still missed Marja. The Grand Viceroy tilted her head, her narrow eyes burrowing into me.
From what I've read, you and Miss Jankowski were drinking in these very woods, as teenagers often do. You returned to Emyr Manor while she started walking back to the nearby village of Stanadwyr, where she lived with her family. On the walk home, Miss Jankowski, still intoxicated, fell and hit her head on a chunk of jagged stone. That killed her.
She had been so perfect. My perfect princess. I remember how she used to scrunch up her face and pout when she was angry. There had never been a more perfect vision of beauty than Marja Jankowski's cute little face when she was angry. Ancient pain writhed and wriggled in my gut, making me feel like I needed to vomit. Suddenly I was a love-struck teenager once again, fighting with the scalding fire that burned in my heart like an erupting volcano. I had never processed emotions like a normal person. It was always huge, cataclysmic rushes of feeling, or a howling pit of nothingness. I had been utterly unable to keep a lid on the tsunami of raw emotion that Marja brought out in me. What's your point? I asked again, feeling a sheen of hot sweat pooling on my forehead. It wasn't my fault. Marja used to tease me, she used to entice me. I remember her running her hands over me, whispering, "I bet you're a great fuck," in my ear, then licking my cheek. Her absence was a deep, chasmal void that festered and putrefied the very essence of who I was. Losing Marja had made me worse.
Let me tell you what I think happened.
The Grand Viceroy was smirking as she spoke.
I think a teenaged Bethan Wikroof, drunken in love, confessed to her very best friend that she had romantic feelings for her. I think those feelings were unreciprocated. I think that made you angry. I think you killed Marja Jankowski and made it look like an accident.
I had done more than confess my feelings, but I didn't feel like sharing that with the Grand Viceroy. I had babbled like a mad woman to Marja about how perfect she was, about how we were destined to be together. And then I had proposed to her. I couldn't have known how she would react. It wasn't my fault she wanted me, until she didn't. I could hear Marge's cruel laughter echoing in my head. What are you? Some kind of f***? There is something so painful about love that goes unanswered. Like every value and principle you ever held could melt away. If only they would love you back. What could be more embarrassing than your head teeming with thoughts and your heart burning with passion, whilst their eyes pass right through you? Oh, Marja, why couldn't you love me back? My hands balled into fists. That's a wonderful theory, Grand Viceroy, I replied, fighting to keep the sheen of rage and anxiety from blighting the tone of my voice. But that's all it is. A theory. The Grand Viceroy let out a soft chuckle, whilst her royal guards remained still as statues. If they were at all impacted by our conversation, they didn't let it show.
It's like I said, Miss Wikroof.
Pritiara Marja Fahad said firmly.
Your facade of normalcy may be enough to fool others, but it won't fool me, because you and I are exactly alike.
So often, situations like this were a dance. Two performers swirling around each other, whirling and twirling with their words, as each participant sought to dazzle the other with their quick wit and snappy retorts. The Grand Viceroy was not a dancer. She was a fighter. She fought with her words, stabbing and slashing where others spun to the rhythm of silent music. If I wanted to push back against her, I needed to slip outside the boundaries she was creating. You keep trying to frame us as similar. I tried to project a mask of confidence that was light years away from the anxiety that was tightening in my chest. Most people wouldn't want to be compared to little old me.
I'm not most people,
The Grand Viceroy replied. You're right, I told her. Most people don't try so hard to manipulate and intimidate every time they take a breath. You should let the power you wield speak for yourself. You're coming across as a bit desperate, and I'm getting second-hand embarrassment. For the briefest, infinitesimal fraction of a moment, I saw a tiny flicker of hesitancy in Pretty Ara's cold features. There you are, I thought to myself. There's the woman behind the curtain. I was surprised to see that Emyr Manor looked much the same as I remembered it. I was half expecting the enormous house to have fallen into a state of disrepair, but it was still the same vast swathe of bold stone and sloping roofs that I had spent so many years in. The manor was speckled with rectangular windows and surrounded by a vibrant clump of flourishing trees. Flecks of dark grey marred the chunky bricks Emyr was made from, leaving spindly fissures threading throughout the old stonework. The manor's entrance was a pair of vast doors inlaid with the ancient sigil of House Wickruth, a dazzling violet sun at the heart of a field of bright pink stars. Sitting in the middle of the double doors was a cold iron knocker, fashioned into the likeness of a snarling wolf, with a large ring clasped in its maw. When I was an idiot child, I called the wolf Barry. I don't know why I decided that an inanimate object needed a name, or why Barry was a fitting title for a feral beast wrought from iron. Children are fucking idiots. To be fair to them, most adults are fucking idiots too.
Some minor work has been done to keep the manor habitable,
The Grand Viceroy explained to me as our car ground to a halt.
but Emyr should be predominantly as it was when you lived here.
A gaggle of soldiers were waiting for us as we arrived at the manor, who snapped to attention the second that Pretty Ara stepped out of the vehicle. These were an elite guardsmen dressed in the decadent purple and gold of the Grand Viceroy's twin protectors. These were box-standard soldiers in basic armour, clutching standard-issue weapons. Looking at the assembled soldiers, I found myself thinking of the Zivashi troopers that had killed Dad and shot me in the head. Grand Viceroy, one of the guardsmen was saying as I slipped out of the car. Everything has been prepared per your specifications in the grounds behind the house. I heard one of Pretty Ara's royal guards speak for the very first time.
Return to your duties, Captain, as you were.
The royal guards spoke in a booming, somewhat robotic-sounding tone. Their features were obscured by their opulent golden helmets, but the mechanical timbre of their voice implied that they may have some cybernetic enhancements. It stood to reason that some of the most deadly and capable warriors at the Kefaru party's disposal would have been augmented with state-of-the-art technology. Some of the other mercenaries I'd served with in Sith Wraith had sought to elevate their capabilities by becoming cyborgs, but I hadn't gone down that road. I told myself that it was because of how prohibitively expensive such technology was, but on some level, I think vanity was a factor. Very few Gortiskans had the money to go cyborg, yet I had still seen people become addicted to augmenting, their organic matter vanishing beneath the sheen of cold metal and hard plastic. I had no desire to trade my fleshy bits for robo-bits. I guessed that I could replace my flabby gut with some kind of rocket launcher. I'll think on it.
We'll use the stone circle in the gardens.
The Grand Viceroy told me, already marching off behind the house.
The Tildrake seem to have a connection to the Gultiska of ancient history, so the oldest section of the ground seems like a rational place to attempt contacting them.
The old stone circle was situated behind Emyr Manor itself, in a small clearing that was about a 15-minute walk from the house. A holdover from the druids of centuries past, the circle was wrought from a handful of enormous white stones, etched with swirling Gultisrig runes. The gigantic stones were such a pale hue that they glowed with a soft golden light during the day, and I had countless fond memories of playing amidst them as a child. What was new was the figure on their knees at the very heart of the stone circle. They looked masculine, but their face was obscured by the large sack that had been pulled over their head. The kneeling man was flanked on both sides by a pair of foot soldiers.
Leave us.
One of Pritiara's royal guards barked at the soldiers, and they quickly slipped away. I know I had no idea what the royal guards looked like under their masks, but there was something ever so slightly sexy about 6-foot cyborgs with deep, husky voices, who got their jobs by being the very best murderers in an army full of murderers. Soon, only the Grand Viceroy, her royal guards, myself, and the kneeling hostage occupied the stone circle. What's the deal there? I asked the Grand Viceroy, nodding at the figure on his knees.
A sacrifice for the Tildrake,
she told me.
Think of it as a gesture of good faith to our mysterious friends.
I imagine a normal person would be horrified by the notion of human sacrifice. But as we have firmly established, I'm an intergalactic megabitch. The Grand Viceroy knew this. It's like she kept telling me. We were the same. My mind was still utterly consumed with agonizing memories of Marja Jonkowski. I longed for her in a deep-rooted, primal way that thrummed down into my bones. That longing seemed to fizzle inside of me like electricity, filling me with a voltic surge of yearning that felt like it was going to come crackling out of my fingertips. I simmered in silence, watching as the Grand Viceroy went about her business.
I bring you the Ragora,
Pritiara Marja Farhad let out her cool, whispery version of a shout.
And I offer you flesh and blood. Let us speak as equals. Reveal yourself to me.
A sudden, biting cold fell over the stone circle. The world seemed to become dark and bitter. It was the middle of the day, yet the sky above us had turned a bleak, melancholy grey. The kneeling hostage started to thrash about in terror, his voice muffled beneath the sack over his head. Creeping black mist began to slink into the stone circle, coating the ground in a dense layer of inky smog. A satisfied smirk skipped across the Grand Viceroy's lips. Something tall and eerily slender rose up out of the fog. It had the vague, gaunt outline of the other Tildrake I'd seen, but only its skeletal silhouette was visible beneath a shifting veil of living darkness. The Tildrake looked like a haggard corpse, whilst the swirling onyx mist that enshrouded it reminded me of a black lace wedding dress. It was all bent limbs and uncanny proportions. This strange, eldritch entity seemed to be an outlandish parody of a person, as if somebody who had never seen a human being before were trying to draw one based on a description of a disturbed child. The creature strode towards the kneeling hostage, long, talon-imbued fingers coiling around the sack on his head.
My sweet boy,
the monster cooed.
Did you think you had escaped me?
A titter of demonic cackling burst out of the Tildrake as it pulled the bag away. A sharp stab of horror plunged through my chest. Zayden Cold stared pleadingly up at me.
The thoughts in my head transformed into a jumble of shrieking noise, beating and pounding against my skull. "Stop!" I shouted almost instantly. "That thing is going to kill him."
That was my intention.
the Grand Viceroy replied dryly. Zayden's mouth had a thick strip of tape stuck over it, and his small hands were bound by a cord of wire. The tail drake loomed over him, caressing his features with its horrific talons. Zayden struggled and squirmed as the creature's claws scraped against his cheek. It was a sort of hazy, flickering creature that your mind might conjure up after days spent trapped in absolute darkness. It was the sort of rippling figure you might see bleeding out of the night when you gazed out of your bedroom window. It was the sort of impossible horror that might go creeping through your nightmares during your loneliest moments. In some moments it was solid, then in the blink of an eye it would become formless, like fog caught in the moonlight. My brain struggled to comprehend the Tildrake, imploring my eyes to turn away from its shifting, inky body. Not him, I snapped frantically at Pritiara. I know him, he's... What is Zayden to me? Why do I care if he lives or dies? He's my mate, I settled on. Please, Grand Viceroy, pick somebody else. Was I so starved of love and attention that I was going to run into the lion's den for Zayden, just because he'd been nice to me when I was feeling shit? Grand Viceroy Pritiara Majafat regarded me with a look of cold irritation. Zayden Cold is a member of a terrorist organization that has taken every opportunity to thwart my plans and stall my progress. The Grand Viceroy retaliated with icy, cutthroat sharpness. Any fondness that you harbor towards this criminal is no concern of mine. The Grand Viceroy's royal guard stepped between me and her, wielding their guns like spears. Just as the twin guards had worn hyper-advanced armor that vastly exceeded the cost and quality of the armor worn by rank-and-file Zavashi soldiers, their weapons were leaps and bounds above simple automatic rifles. I had seen those long, javelin-like guns only once before. During the Varinia uprising, they were Havazat thunder rifles, utilizing devastating bursts of energy rather than a spray of bullets. A Havazat thunder rifle could reduce a human being to a goopy mound of charred sludge with a single squeeze of its trigger. At the Battle of Salsemen, I'd seen a thunder rifle blow a hole in the side of a Quayton tank, treating thick steel as if it were a knife slicing through butter. Now, I had two of those rifles being shoved in my face. What the fuck was I supposed to do? How the hell could I help Zayden? Why was I risking getting blasted into scorched ooze for somebody I barely knew? Whatever I am, whatever the Rigora is, I will help you, Grand Viceroy. My heart was thumping furiously in my chest, whilst I raised my arm submissively above my head. But I am begging you to spare this man. Beg all you want, the Grand Viceroy replied coldly. Your inclinations will not encumber my dream, Forgaltiska. The Tildrake tilted its head, switching its focus from Zayden to me. Perhaps we were wrong about you, it murmured. Such weakness is not befitting of the Rigora. Mercy is repulsive to us. I ignored the monster's needling. Grand Viceroy, please, I pressed on, feeling as if my breath was burning in my lungs. Don't let it kill him. Grand Viceroy Pritiara Majafat's narrow eyes were fixed on the Tildrake. When people looked at me, they only ever saw what they wanted to see. Most saw a harmless, generic young woman. Those who knew me more intimately saw repulsive, inhuman evil. Nobody ever saw me as I was. Nobody cared enough to really, truly see me. I was always an instrument, used to serve whatever purpose they wanted. Pranav wanted me to be a dutiful worker, putting my shitty office job above everything else in my life. Griff wanted to gaze up at me in awe, as if I was some infallible goddess who shat rainbows. The Tildrake wanted me to be their heartless, blood-crazed chosen one. Zayden Colt had listened to me rant about my favorite TV show and asked me how my fucking day was. Was I going to risk my life to save him? I guess I was. Seizing control of myself, I mentally slipped back into the driver's seat and let the fearless warrior I had been when I worked for Sith Wraith take the wheel. 4 opponents, the warrior whispered from inside my head. 2 armed with thunder rifles and wearing armor that likely utilizes kinetic redistribution technology. 1 unarmed and unarmored. 1 is a mostly unknown entity, seemingly vulnerable to a weapon known as a smoke stick. I processed what my battle-ready twin was telling me. Knife and pepper spray both useless against the armed hostiles, the voice of the warrior continued. Unsure of the effectiveness of a hellfire grenade against Tildrake, yet it remains the most promising option. The mist-garbed monstrosity stepped past Aiden, turning the inky outline that surfaced its head towards Pretty Aura.
Perhaps you are the Agora,
it postulated.
I can sense the darkness in you. You are brimming with malice.
It is not malice. The Grand Viceroy's voice was so calm that she sounded as if she were reading a menu, not conversing with a walking nightmare. It is the will to do what needs to be done. Make yourself small, the warrior told me. Make them underestimate you. I'll do anything you want, I screeched in the most pathetic voice I could conjure up. Please, please, anything at all, just name it. The Grand Viceroy shriveled her nose up in disgust, taking a single step towards the Tildrake. She thought she had smelled weakness in me, and I was no longer worth her attention, clearly also perceiving me as weak. The Tildrake was fixated on Pretty Aura. It took another step forward.
We see you as you are,
it told the Grand Viceroy.
You would burn the world to claim your prize.
Wary of the hell fiend that was looming above Pretty Aura, her royal guards turned away from me, aiming their thunder rifles at the Tildrake. This was the best opening I was going to get. Now! The voice of the warrior commanded me. I yanked the hellfire grenade out of my handbag, ripped the pin free, and lobbed it at the Grand Viceroy.